Welcome back. So today we are going to learn about reflexes and how they relate to anatomy and physiology of the human body. And in order to do that, we need to go back a little bit and talk about some characteristics of the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system. So in order to have a reflex, it's going to involve both sensory and motor neurons. And so we have about 10 million sensory neurons coming from those sensory receptors all throughout our body, both in our viscera, as well as our skeletal muscle, our glands, and our skin. And some of those neurons in a reflex will synapse with some of the 20 billion interneurons we have, whereas others will go directly to the motor neurons. And we only have about 500,000 motor neurons. So you can see some converging of information must occur in order to get some type of motor activity as a result of sensory input. So in order to talk about reflexes, these neurons are going to be organized, these interneurons, excuse me, are going to be organized into what we call neuronal pools. And this is a functional group, kind of like the osteon was the functional portion of compact bone. So this is the functional group of the interneurons. And don't forget, interneurons are only found in the central nervous system, so they're in the brain and the spinal cord. Now, this neuronal pool may just be in one tiny little specific area of the brain or just one little area of the spinal cord. However, it may involve neurons from several regions. Like, for instance, it could involve neurons in the primary motor cortex, and then involve neurons in the motor association cortex, and then involve neurons, and both of those would be frontal lobe, but different areas in the frontal lobe. And then it may involve neurons, for instance, in the temporal lobe if we were talking about speaking. Okay. And so when we look at these neuronal pools, we have someplace between a couple of hundred and a few thousand of these. There isn't an exact number. Now, in addition to neuronal pools, we have what we call neural circuits. And this is basically describing how the neurons in a neuronal pool are interacting with each other. Okay. And their method of interaction gives a clue as to the function of that neuronal pool. And there's going to be several types, which we're going to go over on the next page. The most complex of these, of course, would be up in the brain, whereas the simplest would be in the spinal cord, giving our peripheral nervous system, giving us these autonomic reflexes. So let's look at these a little bit closer on two different slides. So on the first slide, we're going to talk about three types of neuronal circuits. And the first one is one where the information in one neuron is diverging. In other words, it is splitting, sending the exact same information to multiple neurons on the other side of a synapse, okay? So it could be one neuron to several neurons, or it could be one neuronal pool giving information to multiple neuronal pools as well. And what this does is it takes the information from that, wherever it was coming from, and now it gets more neurons involved, allowing this broad distribution of whatever that little sensory input was. And this is what always happens when sensory information is brought into the central nervous system, where it's going to spread among multiple neuronal pools. And I think you can clearly see in this picture, we have one neuron going to two neurons, and then each of those second neurons going to three neurons, okay? And what happens is now that they're in three separate neurons from the two, now we have six neurons all dealing with the same information that came from that very first neuron. And this is called parallel processing, where multiple neurons or multiple neuronal pools are now processing the exact same information simultaneously. And so in order to have parallel processing, you had to have divergence at least once, if not multiple times before that. And what this enables to happen is that at the end, we can have many responses, not just one neuron affecting one little motor unit, but we can have multiple neurons at the other end, all creating responses. And then the third type of circuit on this page is what's called serial processing, where information is relayed directly from one neuron to another neuron to another neuron to another neuron, okay? Or one neuronal pool to another neuronal pool to another neuronal pool to another neuronal pool. And this is what's happening, for instance, when we're having sensory information relayed from one part of the brain to another, from the primary somatosensory post-central gyrus to the sensory association area to more specific areas. Okay. So those three, as you can see, are kind of all intertwined with each other. And you can't have the parallel processing if you don't have the divergence. Now, the opposite of divergence is known as convergence, where several neurons are bringing information and sending it to only one neuron on the other end of a synapse. And we've talked about this previously in the class when we talked about you have maybe 3 messages saying you are cold and 1 message you're saying you're hot, so that other postsynaptic neuron is figuring out, okay, we're going to send out the message that we're hot. Okay. And so what this is going to allow is lots of information to come out, but a more consistent answer going out. And the other place where this is important is, for instance, if you consider the diaphragm. The diaphragm is under both subconscious and conscious control. So at this point in the class, you understand the diaphragm, when it contracts, it enables you to inhale or to breathe. Okay. And when you're sleeping at night, that's happening subconsciously. And so your diaphragm is getting messages which originated in your brainstem and then traveled in neurons to your diaphragm to stimulate it to contract. However, we also know that if you want to inhale, you can inhale. So everybody inhale now. Okay, so see, we had both conscious and subconscious control happening for this motor activity to happen. So that, using the diaphragm was just an example to show you, but it happens other places in your body as well. And the last type of neural circuit is one known as reverberation, where it's continuing on. Okay. And the way this happens is that there is a neuron whose axon is going to branch, as you see in the pink neuron at the bottom. So if this neuron is myelinated, it would branch at a node of Ranvier. And what happens is the axon terminals, terminal boutonnes of that branch go back earlier in the circuit to a neuron earlier that was stimulating the neuron that branched. And it is giving positive feedback, essentially, where that previous neuron is then going to stimulate that branch neuron again. And so not only will you have this part, but the other part of the axon is going to continue along its pathway. And so once you activate a reverberating circuit, it's going to continue until either, for instance, you run out of neurotransmitters, or all the neurotransmitter receptors are full, or you get inhibitory stimuli that break the cycle. So those are examples of neural circuits. So how does that apply to reflexes? Well, reflexes we've talked about before. We've talked about the 5 steps of reflexes, and the middle 3 are 3 types of neurons, and we may or may not have the interneuron in a reflex. And this whole point of today's talk is these reflexes are keeping us in homeostasis, and they are making these rapid subconscious adjustments in the functions of many of our organs and organ systems without us realizing it at all. Now, there's very little variability. We know that if this certain receptor is stimulated, it's going to cause this reflex, and we're going to have this effective response. And if we come back 2 minutes from now and do that, we're going to have the exact same response. If we come back tomorrow and do it, we're going to have the exact same kind of response. We come back next week and do it, it's going to be the exact same kind of response. So it's very predictable with little variability. So when we're looking at specific reflexes, and there are a lot of them, but we're only going to learn maybe about 5 of them. Okay. We can classify them 4 different ways. We can classify them how they were developed. We can classify them what kind of motor response we're getting. We can classify them by the complexity of the circuits, or we can classify them where is the information processing that happening. Okay, so these 4 categories, they're not mutually exclusive. For instance, a reflex can be categorized not only developmentally, but also with the complexity and the side of information processing, as well as the nature. You can use all 4 of them on a reflex. So they are not mutually exclusive. They are just different ways of describing it. So let's look at this classification first. So here are the 4 different ways: development, response, complexity, and site of processing. So let's start on the left, and we're going to go counterclockwise. So by development, we classify them either into innate or acquired. And what the word innate means, in case you don't know, it means it's something you are born with. Nothing had to happen for you to have this. So later on, we're going to have innate immunity when you learn about the lymphatic immune system and your second later on. But right now we're talking about innate reflexes. Sorry. And so innate reflexes are very predictable. So here's a classic one. In newborn babies, if we put the nipple for a baby bottle or the mother's breast nipple or even your pinky finger into the mouth of a baby, they will start sucking on it. This is called the suckling reflex. It's an innate reflex. You do not have to teach a newborn how to suckle to get milk. It's just a normal reflex that occurs. In contrast to these innate reflexes, acquired reflexes are those that you are conditioned and you learn to do them. Now, these are also rapid and automatic, just like the innate ones were, but by repetition, you can condition these reflexes. And this is what, for instance, basketball players who are trying to perfect their free throw shot, they're trying to learn exactly like when to release the, like this kind of pressure. Anyway, it becomes very involved, but like some of those muscle memory things you have heard about are utilizing these acquired reflexes. So that's by development. By response, we're going to go to categories how we describe the nervous system. Somatic reflexes are those that control your skeletal muscles, whereas visceral reflexes, you could also call autonomic reflexes because they are going to involve your non-voluntary structures such as your smooth muscle, your cardiac muscle, your glands, adipose tissue. All right. So that's 2 of the 4. The third classification is by complexity of the circuit. And the simplest are going to be those that are monosynaptic, where you only have 1 synapse, mono being a prefix that means 1. And the 1 synapse is going to be sensory neuron to motor neuron. 1 synapse there at all, between neurons, okay? Obviously, there's activity, there's synapse between the motor neuron and the effector, but when we're talking about monosynaptic, we're talking 2 neurons only. Whereas polysynaptic will involve at least 2 synapses, so at least 3 neurons, and could involve hundreds of neurons, okay? And so because we have neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron, this is going to take longer to occur. So you're going to have a longer delay between the stimulus and the response, but we also can get a lot more complicated responses because we can include convergence and divergence and parallel processing and all those things. And as a result of that, we actually can stimulate not only just 1 motor unit, which is all a monosynaptic one's going to do, but we can hit multiple muscle groups at the same time. So the last way we classify reflexes is by where they are processed. And the cranial reflexes are processed in the brain. Specifically, we're talking about the nuclei in the brain, right? Because that's where we need to find cell bodies are in the nuclei. So think your basal nuclei or your substantia nigra. Those are examples of nuclei that we've learned in this course. Whereas spinal reflexes are processing in the spinal cord. So it could be just at one level in the spinal cord, coming in at the T5 level, going out at the T5 level, or they could be intersegmental, where they're either going up or going down segments, going up for carrying sensor information and coming down for splitting out motor information. And this can give us really complicated but coordinated reflexes. Okay, so now I think we're ready to talk about some reflexes. And we're going to start with one that we have alluded to for weeks now, and that is called the stretch reflex, which is, in its simplest form, a monosynaptic reflex. So in the picture to the right, it's only including the blue neuron and the red neuron. It's not including the purple and the dotted red, which I will refer to, I think, in about 2 slides from now. And so stretch reflexes automatically regulate the length of skeletal muscle, and it's using those muscle spindle sensors in the muscle belly itself to determine the response. And now we have a lot of stretch reflexes we don't even think about. For instance, our erector spinae muscles next to our back, that's what's holding us in our upright posture. So that is constantly changing the degree of contraction and relaxation all day long. But in this case, we're talking the patellar reflex. So in the patellar reflex, in the little box there, I explained what's actually happening there. And what you are doing when you hit the patellar ligament, that actually lengthens the ligament because it smushes it in a little bit. So it makes it just a tiny little bit longer. And by doing that, that is stretching the quadriceps muscles just a tiny little bit more, because remember, all 4 quadricep muscles are inserting through this patellar ligament. And this is going to trigger an almost immediate motor response where the stretched muscle is now going to contract. And as you recall, the function of all the quadriceps muscle, when it contracts, it is going to extend the knee. And that's what's make the leg kicks out. So this entire reflex happens very quickly in about 30 milliseconds. And the reason why it does is because the neurons involved here are large myelinated neurons. Okay. Now this reflex may involve something called reciprocal inhibition, which is what that purple and the dotted red neurons are showing to, but I'm going to explain that in a couple slides from now, not right now. So the second type of reflex is a withdrawal reflex. And a withdrawal reflex, by definition, is going to be polysynaptic. Okay? And what this does is it moves the body part away from a stimulus. And so it is strongest if it's going to be triggered by pain. However, there are some types of touch and pressure that can cause a withdrawal reflex as well. So this reflex is not quite as predictable because it's activating many pools of interneurons. So the intensity, the location of the stimuli will change the strength and the character of the response. And so an example of this is a flexor reflex of your limb muscles, whether you're holding a hot frying pan because you didn't realize it was still hot and so you didn't use a pot holder, or as in the picture, you are stepping on a tack. Okay. So when you are stepping on a tack, what the picture shows is you have activated your sensory neurons, and eventually you're going to excite your motor neurons, and that is going to cause your flexors to contract, which basically will flex the knee, because to step on the tack, you had to extend your knee, right? Because you were stepping on it. And so the reciprocal, so in other words, the flexor reflex is to flex the muscles so that you will no longer be standing on it. So you extended your quadriceps, but now you are flexing your hamstring muscles to withdraw the leg from the source of pain. Now, if you're standing on one leg only, that would mean you're going to fall on your face. Now, the good news is most of the time when we are walking, the other leg comes down, and so you would be standing, so you may be standing on two legs almost immediately. But the way this happens is through this process known as reciprocal inhibition. So what that means is when a specific muscle contracts, the opposing muscles must relax, okay? So if the flexors are contracting, the extensors are relaxing, the extensors are contracting, the flexors are relaxing. Okay. So that's how you lifted your leg off of the tack. That's how you knew when you were contracting around the hot pan to drop the hot pan. Okay. That's how we had the reflex of the patellar reflex, where the extensors were contracted, that now the flexors are going to be contracted. But in the case of standing on the tack, in addition to reciprocal inhibition, something else that was occurring is what was called the crossed extensor reflex. Okay. And so this involves a reflex arc on the other side. Okay. So as you can see in the diagram, we have interneurons traveling to the other side of the spinal cord. Okay. And so not only in addition to the reciprocal inhibition happening on the same side of the body, we are now going to have a reflex on the contralateral side of the body. And so this can only occur if we have a polysynaptic reflex, because a monosynaptic reflex will not be crossing to the other side. That gray commissure only involves those interneurons. So this can give us intersegmental distribution at different levels of the spinal cord. It's going to be involved in the reciprocal inhibition. It can give us reverberating circuits. We can have all of those things involved. And so if you look at this picture, what it is showing is when you step on that painful stimulus, in addition to the reflexes we have talked about previously, where the extensors of the foot that stepped on it are inhibited and the flexors are stimulated, on the other side of the body, the extensors are going to be stimulated so you actually can stand on the other foot and the flexors will be inhibited. Now, the cross extensor reflex is not going to happen if you're holding a hot pan, because you don't need it, because there's no requirement for it. But your body recognizes that if you pick up the leg you're standing on and you don't extend the other one, it's not going to result in something that is kind to your body. And so we have this innate reflex that we have. So what is the clinical significance of these reflexes? We can use them to figure out where damage occurs in the central nervous system. Okay. For instance, if we have normal reflexes happening in our upper extremity, whether it's the biceps reflex or the triceps reflex, that would indicate that obviously spinal nerves in that area are intact. But if we lose our patellar reflex, then that means we've lost them in that area. But if we keep our patellar reflex, but we lose our ankle jerk reflexes or our plantar reflexes, that means more inferiorly we would have damage between those two levels. So there are pictures of the other reflexes in your book, but I'm not going to talk about them in detail at all. So as we talked about before, the brain can inhibit or facilitate these spinal reflexes. And we can talk about something called reinforcement, where we can use more motor neurons in the reflex than what ordinarily would happen. And the easiest way to do this is through a technique of distraction known as the gymnastic maneuver, and you don't need to know that it's called the gymnastic maneuver. It's one of the examples of distraction techniques. And for this one, you interlock your fingers like this, and then you pull them apart, or you attempt to pull them apart, keeping your digits flexed while somebody is testing, for instance, lower extremity reflexes. And this works even if you know you are being distracted, okay? And what this does is it makes the reflex more significant. So for instance, if you are actively trying to inhibit the reflex to show that you don't have it, this distraction technique will make it more likely to be seen. All right. So there's one more reflex I wanted to talk about. And in order to do that, I need to explain what a Babinski sign is, which is also known as a positive Babinski reflex in the clinical scenario. And first, I want you to realize this is a normal finding in babies, but abnormal in adults. And so what happens is, if, for instance, this was a baby's foot, and here was the big toe, and there's the pinky toe, if you stroke the lateral aspect of the baby's foot and go over towards the big toe, what you would find is the big toe extends, and the other digits abduct. They fan out. So normally, like an infant's toes are like this, slightly curled. But if you do this, they do that. Okay. Now, this reflex is there in all of the newborns, and it's something that is tested in the newborn physical to make sure that it's there. And then what happens as the nervous system develops, because if you recall, we have a lot of plasticity in the nervous system, but what happens is initially you're born with what are called upper motor neurons. In other words, neurons that are between the brain and the spinal cord. And then you will develop your lower motor neurons later on. And these are the neurons that go between the spinal cord and the effector organs. Okay. And so what happens is as these descending pathways develop, and you end up with these lower motor neurons going to the effector organs, they are going to inhibit this spinal reflex. So this is just showing that only brain and spinal cord are intact, and it's showing that we don't have these lower motor neurons involved. So that brings us to the test that we do in adults called the plantar reflex, where, as you can see, we're stroking in the same portion of the sole of the foot. It doesn't work on the top of the foot. It's only on the sole of the foot. And the normal adult reflex when this happens is that you curl all your toes down and you go, whoo, that gave me goosebumps or something. Whereas the abnormal reflex, or the positive Babinski sign, is where you do the exact same thing that the newborns do. And so if you have a positive Babinski, this lets the clinician know that there is damage either to the descending tracts connecting to the lower motor neurons, or there's a damage in the higher centers, for instance, in the brain. And with that, we are done talking about reflexes. And I want to thank you for all your hard work, and I will see you again soon. Thank you.